As this week's European summit approaches, the leaders of Germany and France try to strike a deal. At stake, the future of Europe. EU officials are pushing for more integration and more power over national budgets. Is this the defining moment for Europe? You're watching Inside Story. Hello there, good to have you with us. Welcome to the programme. I'm Shuli Ghosh. The German Chancellor Angela Merkel is in Paris on Wednesday to try to find common ground with the new French president. The two leaders are deeply divided over how to deal with Europe's financial crisis. Francois Hollande has made growth his priority and has openly challenged Merkel's insistence on austerity. It's the first split between Berlin and Paris since the debt crisis began 30 months ago. And there are likely to be more battles ahead as a crucial European Council meeting begins in Brussels on Thursday. Officials are pushing a radical proposal to turn the Eurozone into a fully-fledged political federation within a decade. Germany is in favour of more economic and political integration, but other countries like France and Britain are reluctant to give up some of their national sovereignty. So what is the plan actually proposing? Basically, it will mean more power for the European authorities. That includes setting limits on how much debt each country can take on, with the power to veto national budgets if a country is likely to go over that. Creating a European Treasury Office to control a central budget and monitor national ones. And establishing a new European banking union to supervise the big national banks. And perhaps the most contentious, they want deeper political integration through joint decision-making with national parliaments. The European Commission President, Jose Manuel Barroso, said the plan was a defining moment for European integration.
A vicious circle has become established, whereby the use of taxpayers' funds to rescue banks makes sovereigns weaker, while the increasingly risk-averse banks stop lending to businesses that need funds, making the economy, and the banking sector with it, slow down, which again further weakens the sovereign. We can break this negative cycle now if we are bold enough to establish a strong and integrated financial framework. For a genuine economic and monetary union to be established, I think we need a banking union, a fiscal union, and further steps towards a political union.
So, a banking union, a fiscal union and steps towards a political union. Let's see what our guests have to say. They're joining us all from London today. Raoul Ruparel, economist and head of economic research at the think tank Open Europe. Anne Pettifor, Director of Prime, a London-based economic think tank and a fellow at the New Economic Foundation. And George Kratsas, teaching assistant at University College London. George specialises in sovereign funds and EU law. Warm welcome to all my guests today. Raoul, let's start with you. This plan is surely the most ambitious European plan since Maastricht. Is closer integration inevitable?
Well, I think it is moving that way, and this is definitely the most ambitious plan that has been proposed throughout this whole crisis, and as you rightly said, in the past 2 decades. But if you look at the plan, it's still very short on detail and very vague. I think they have the broad ideals there, and there's some agreement on where they want to go and what they want to do in terms of the banking and the fiscal side. But the details and the policy proposals are very thin on the ground. We saw the report released by the Commission earlier this week came in at only 7 pages. I mean, that's very much a vague proposal laying out some key talking points for this summit, but this is very, very early stages. And even that proposal admitted that, they're looking at another report, another further assessment in December. So even then, we'll still only be on the way to these grand proposals. And that's one of the issues here.
This is going to be one of the issues that's going to come up at Brussels, whether there can be some kind of broad-based consensus, particularly between France and Germany.
Exactly. And it's really a crux of the issue. Can France and Germany agree? And I think they're looking at it from different starting points. France is looking for greater spending now, greater fiscal integration and greater banking union now, whereas Germany has a view that before any of that happens, there has to be greater political and budget union so that the right controls are there, so that when the spending does take place and when the risks are shared, that they're accountable and that people are not encouraged to be more wasteful or get into similar problems that they have this time around. So although there is a broad agreement on the long-term plans, I think the starting point still needs to be worked out. And I think there are plenty of big issues here which France and Germany differ on.
Anne, I know that this is what markets want to see, a more integrated and unified European Union, but it does seem that France and Germany are poles apart, and there are other issues which other nations are going to disagree on.
Absolutely, and markets are not accountable to the European public, and so really what we should be thinking about is what the people of Europe want, and that's not really being taken into account in my view. But for me the really big problem is the starting point for these discussions. The starting point from Mrs. Merkel, for example, is that budget deficits are the problem. And indeed she goes as far as to say that they are the root cause of the crisis in the Eurozone today. Well, they're not actually. They are a symptom of the private banking crisis in Europe. And what this proposal from the European Commission does is to ignore that crisis, and is to ignore in particular the role that the European Central Bank should play in stabilizing the crisis. And so it's by if you like, trying to institutionalize Maastricht into a treaty which will be unchangeable by the people of Europe. The thing about these treaty changes is that they require unanimity, and therefore it'll never be possible to alter them or amend them. And,
but what Germany wants to do, I mean, Germany's big issue, Angela Merkel's big issue, is that she doesn't want to see German taxpayers taking on more liability, more of the burden of paying for these banks and these countries which have run up huge debts.
Well, that's the point. I mean, we in Britain and in the United States have central banks which are able to provide liquidity to the banking system and indeed to the sovereign without drawing on the resources of taxpayers. But what is happening in Europe is that taxpayers are having the full burden of costs thrust on them. And I agree with German taxpayers, that isn't fair. But the ECB is simultaneously stoically refusing to play a role in, for example, supporting the Spanish sovereign government. So it's that problem which is not being discussed in this report or by the European Commission, and which is not at the heart of tomorrow's discussions, which I think is the stumbling block.
George, what do you think? Because, I mean, Anne brings up a very important point. I mean, but banking regulation is one thing that is being discussed here, with greater supervision of national banks.
Well, certainly what we have here is a multi-stage process, which indeed will take a very long time to achieve. But let's see tomorrow in the European Council as a starting point. First of all, we would have to discuss the European leaders will have to discuss the prospect of a banking union, thus by pushing forward very critical institutional reforms, such as the creation of resolution funds, recapitalization funds, and joint deposit insurance funds, as well as central regulation and supervision. However, this is not enough, as in the long term, such a banking union would have to be accompanied by a political union or a fiscal union, if you will, just to avoid the possibility that any Eurozone member would choose to exit the euro in the safety of the knowledge that their banks are guaranteed. Now, it's not, as you understand, it's something that will take a long time, maybe even 5 years to achieve. However, what is important to receive as early as possible is the assurances of the European leaders that they will not look at they will not adopt any short-term measures, but rather longer-term to ensure to stabilize the markets.
I mean, you were talking about political union and fiscal union there. I mean, a lot of countries are worried about what that means for national sovereignty. And I guess as well, if we're extending this outside the Eurozone, non-Euro countries are also worried about what it's going to mean for their national sovereignty. I mean, Britain, for example, is very worried.
Well, a degree of transfer of national sovereignty to the Eurozone level will have to be a necessary concession for achieving a shared responsibility and collectively back Eurozone debt. Now, this is not such a big problem as it may be played out. In fact, European people are very used to transfer of sovereignty. This is indeed what the EU is all about, is a transfer of a degree of sovereignty, of decision-making from the national level to the EU level. Now, in order to maintain our monetary union, we will have to look at this possibility in greater detail in the future as well.
Isn't that going to mean a whole new treaty, George?
It is going to require an amendment of the treaties in the longer term, but what is essential, I mean, there are many institutional reforms which can be looked at a later stage, such as an agreement on the budget by the Eurozone. But however, what is important to have at this stage is assurance, a collective assurance of Eurozone debt, because this is the only viable option we can have at the moment.
Raoul, let me bring you in. I mean, clearly the debt problem is the looming thing at the moment. One idea is the Eurobond. Now, this is a core disagreement between some countries. I mean, France, for example, likes the idea. Merkel says, over my dead body. What do you think?
Well, I think I'm technically with the Germans on this one. I think that they're correct to say that, you know, it's not a short-term solution to the crisis. And although it may give some long-term assurances, you have to wonder whether that will be enough. I mean, the assurances have been given numerous times during this crisis, and they failed to quell the market jitters. And you also have to look at things like the Spanish bailout. I mean, they've assured them of 100 billion in capital, and yet that lasted only a few hours in quelling the market. So the assurance idea is not always consistent. I don't think just saying that we'll move to Eurobonds at some point will really be enough to convince the markets and convince everyone that this Eurozone crisis will be solved, because ultimately there's a huge number of political obstacles going from here to the creation of Eurobonds, and you know, doing that and just saying that we will do it is not going to be enough. And I don't think anyone is yet convinced that they can get over the domestic political hurdles in countries such as Germany, Finland and Netherlands to push through something such as Eurobonds. So to some extent, although I think that might be you know, a solution in the very long term, and it might end up where the Eurozone needs to go, right now talking about it detracts from some of the more key issues, such as figuring out exactly what Spanish bank needs and what the European banks need to clean up the toxic assets on their books, how to deal with the situation in Greece and how to renegotiate the Greek bailout package, if at all, and how to deal with upcoming issues in Italy, both politically and economically. So there's something stuck there between the short term and the long term, and unfortunately being stuck in between the two means not much ever gets done.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And I think one of the major criticisms that has been levelled repeatedly at European leaders is that they've been slow to respond. They've had a piecemeal response. There's been no consensus. So I suppose arguably looking for more integration is going to be the thing that they're aiming for. But it's very questionable about whether they're going to get that at Brussels.
Yes, the point is what they're trying to do is put the cart before the horse. I mean, it really is important to get political buy-in for this, and they're not starting with the political buy-in. They're starting with a banking union and with a fiscal union. And what they're trying to do is, I mean, there's of course, I agree with George that there has to be a transfer of sovereignty, but it's a question of the transfer of democracy as well. And what the European Commission is trying to do is to entrench into a treaty policy upon which the people of Europe will not be able to vote or will not be able to alter in the future. And that is what's going to make it really difficult to implement this, aside from the fact that it really doesn't address the issue. And I just want to say one small thing. You know, one of the things they are insisting on is that GDP debt levels should never exceed 60% of GDP and budget deficits never 3% of GDP. But Germany, when she was trying, and I don't agree with what Germany was doing, when she was trying to lower labour costs and when she was trying to increase her competitiveness between 2003 and 2005, that was the moment at which her debt levels relative to GDP rose well above the 60% limit. So what Germany and the European Commission are asking the periphery countries to do is to increase their competitiveness and to cut labour costs, and to do that without increasing the debt in the way that Germany did between 2003 and 2005. That is illogical, it is wrong, it is flawed economics. And it's this attempt to turn policy into concrete, if you like, and say that it cannot respond to changing economic circumstances, that is at the heart of why this thing will never succeed.
Do you agree with that, George?
Well, I certainly agree with Anne, and I partially agree with Raoul on the point that Eurobonds alone are not sufficient to offer decisive assurances to the markets. However, we should look at Eurobonds in a greater context, that before the Eurobonds come, then a banking union would be established first. In addition, there would be further institutional reforms, such as, for example, extending the mandate of the European Central Bank to become a lender of last resort. Now, all those solutions, they should be looked at as against their alternatives. The alternative would be...
Sorry, Anne, what do you want to say?
Yes,
Sorry, I wanted to say to George that that solution of amending the mandate of the European Central Bank, Articles 1, 2, 3, 5 and 7 of the treaties, is not even on the table. It is not even being discussed. And therefore, Raul says we should address the problem of the Spanish banks. We can't do that in the absence of a central bank that refuses to play the role of lender of last resort. That crisis cannot be addressed in that way.
Do you agree with that, Raoul?
Without the ECB playing
well, I mean, it depends how you categorise addressing the problem. Getting the central bank to simply buy up their toxic assets or just lend them extra liquidity isn't really solving the problem necessarily. I mean, their banks need to be completely restructured. The whole system needs to be reformed. The whole system and the whole economy needs to rebalance away from the housing sector and things. And so I think just extending the mandate of the ECB and allowing it to buy up any toxic asset across the Eurozone is not really an answer. And we've seen huge amounts of liquidity poured into the system already.
But
I mean, it's a key point.
The point is that it shouldn't be the German taxpayers having to solve the Spanish banks' problem. It should be the ECB that should address the Spanish banking problem.
Who underpins the ECB? It's still the taxpayers. The ECB is still underpinned by German taxpayers and by taxpayers.
But Raoul, I think what Anne is saying, I mean, the issue of Eurobonds is because Germany is clearly the stronger economy, then Germany would have the burden of underwriting those Eurobonds, and therefore Germany would have more responsibility, more liability, and Angela Merkel will not have that without a greater federalism within the EU.
But they won't have the ECB without that either. I mean, the ECB ultimately, if it does start lending more, it will lend money to these countries and banks, and there needs to be controls on where that money goes and how it is implemented. And the ECB doesn't have the conditionality to do that. And that is why you need the political and budget union and the conditions set up first. And that's what Germany is asking for. And I think that is what Germany sees as the starting point, whether you go down the ECB road or the Eurobond road. Yeah, that's simply my point. And so, you need to have that. And that's where the Germans are starting from. And that's why, you won't get the ECB or the Eurobonds without this political and budget union first.
OK, let's move on, because one thing I am interested in is how leaders are going to sell this to their country. I mean, Anne has made the point earlier that, are the people getting what they want? George, are we going to see a raft of referendums here? Because there's going to be huge changes ultimately in how Europeans are governed and how they're taxed, or what their tax money is used for.
Well, we've had a few developments recently that can give us an idea of how European people would respond. For example, we've had a referendum in Ireland and concerning whether Ireland should be included in the European, the ASM. And in addition, we've had the Greek elections, where Greek citizens have already voted for the stability of remaining within the Eurozone and continuing with the reform package. Now, this is not to say that, for example, Greek citizens have not expressed their grievance in those elections. However, the majority has already expressed a clear preference for the stability of the euro. Now, it is a matter of explaining to voters, to European voters, what the stakes are in this case, because there are indeed forces, Eurosceptic forces, that begin to rise throughout Europe. I mean, it wasn't just in Greece. Silvio Berlusconi recently has announced some plans to become a candidate in the next elections on a Eurosceptic platform and on supporting that Italy should exit the euro. Now, my view is voters throughout the Eurozone will not look at those prospects very favorably once they understand what the stakes are here.
Okay, let me come back to Britain, because earlier this month the British Prime Minister David Cameron said he backed closer integration among the 17 Eurozone countries, but he made it clear that Britain wouldn't be involved.
I have no doubt that the single currency countries will want to seek greater integration. That is clearly going to happen over the coming months and years. Britain's not in the single currency. We won't be joining the single currency, so we won't take part in that integration. But we know that it's necessary for the single currency to deal with these issues so that it can work properly in the future.
And so Cameron says he likes the idea of closer integration, but not for Britain, thanks very much. Are we going to end up with a two-speed Europe here?
Well, I think, the British will stay out. We prize our sovereignty and our democracy highly, have fought for it over many, many decades. And I think you'll find that having bureaucrats dictate policy to us is deeply resented by the British people. I agree with George that in Europe there is a great yearning for unity. There's a great yearning for stability and peace, and I endorse that personally. I think we cannot have a Eurozone that is divergent, because we know what happened in the past when countries diverged in their interests. But the problem is not Berlusconi. Berlusconi is reacting to the very strong feelings arising in Italy, for example, against austerity. And it's austerity that's causing divergence. On the one hand, people want unity and they want peace and stability. On the other, they're being forced into corners because of austerity, because of economic policies which are impoverishing them, while the banks are getting away, if you like, with murder. And that is causing a rise in protectionism and nationalism in Europe, which I find quite frightening. And I don't blame Berlusconi for that. I blame austerity policies, and I blame the rigidity of economic policies where bureaucrats believe you can impose inflexibly certain, criteria, budget criteria onto governments without consulting the people and without any reference to economic conditions at that time. And we all know that about booms and slumps. We all know that circumstances change, and we all know that policymakers therefore need to have some flexibility. They cannot make policy when the policy is entrenched in law. But the bureaucrats want to entrench policy in legalized institutionalized treaties which cannot be amended. That is profoundly undemocratic and will generate a very bad reaction from the European people in time. Okay,
we are coming to the end of the programme. I just want to ask all my guests whether they think that anything concrete is going to come out of the Brussels summit and whether they're going to be able to save the Eurozone in the long term. Raoul, you first.
Well, I don't think anything concrete will come out of this summit. They may lay some groundwork towards the banking and fiscal unions, and that may appease the markets for a little bit longer. I think that in the longer term, we are going to have Greece dropping out of the euro probably at the start of next year, maybe, possibly Portugal as well. And then that next block that remains may move towards this closer integration. In terms of the summit and the UK, interestingly, I think this will be the first summit where the UK will realise that the banking union plans and some of the plans for fiscal integration may not fit with the single market and the EU and the UK's desire to stay in the single market, and that could create a head-on collision between the UK government and the Eurozone, and that will be an interesting fallout over the next 6 months and a year. Okay, Anne, quick prediction from you?
Well, I just think because they're starting from the wrong starting point, if you like, that the budget deficits are the problem, I don't think that there is a hope that these leaders can exercise leadership tomorrow. And I think their failure to take responsibility, serious responsibility, for fixing this crisis is a great failure of leadership. And I cannot see that overnight we're going to find that leadership exercised.
And final thought from George.
Well, my view is I would disagree with, respectively, with Raul on the point of Greece and Portugal exiting the euro. I do not foresee such a possibility. Whoever leader, whether coming from the European periphery or from the core of Europe, allows such a scenario would have to take responsibility for an immense economic and political cost. And frankly, I don't see that happening. Now, concerning the upcoming European Council, there are an interesting fact is that Angela Merkel seems a little more favorable this time to the possibility of closing the competitiveness gap between Germany and other uncompetitive countries, by taking measures such as increasing wages in Germany, for example. Also, we might be seeing Monti's plan of using ESM funds to buy out Italian debt or debt from other countries from the periphery. They would certainly be very positive developments.
OK, we have to leave it there. An interesting discussion. Thank you very much indeed to all my guests, Raoul Ruparel, Anne Pettifor and George Kratzis. And thank you for joining us on this edition of Inside Story. If you do want to send us your feedback, email us at insidestory@aljazeera.net. Thanks for watching. Bye for now.